Welcome to the Demeere podcast. We talk about martial arts, self-defense, and a whole lot more. And now your host, Demeere.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the podcast. Welcome to episode 34. So I've got a quite interesting show for you guys today with two questions that I will answer. And before we get to that, a quick shout out to one of my patrons, Brian Terry, and he's been a green belt for about 7 months now on Patreon. And I just want to say thanks to you, Brian, for supporting me and my work. And that's what makes everything possible. The podcast, the blog, all the videos on YouTube and Facebook and so on. So a huge shout out to Brian and thank you for your support, man. And if you want to support the show and everything else that I'm doing on internet and so on, well, go to patreon.com/Wim Demeere, my name, and then check it out. Bunch of options that you can use to support what I do, and access to a truckload right now. It's huge, and the library is filling every month. Truckload of content that you can find there at varying levels of support. So check it out and see what happens there. That said, moving on to the next thing, a few quick announcements and just some housekeeping. First things first, the merch is live. Now, a bunch of you guys have asked me for that, and it's finally live. So go to wimsblog.com/merch, MERCH, and you will be taken to the place where you can find it. And what do we have there? Well, we have t-shirts and we have phone cases. We have the infamous, or should I say famous, coffee mug right now. And it has the logo that is now the official logo for my blog. And that is of Randy's Law. And I have talked about Randy's Law before. I will put a link in the show notes just for you guys who haven't heard about that before. That would be strange if you follow my stuff, because I've been talking about this endlessly for years now. But the idea is basically that this is something that Randy said, and it's the differences are just as important as the similarities. And he said that many years ago, and that is something that I try to take to heart. And it's influenced what I do in the martial arts as a teacher, as a practitioner in self-defense and so on. It had a huge influence on me, and that's why I wanted to use that as a logo. It came out quite well, the logo. I like it a lot. And then obviously there's also the famous phrase, what is the law? Well, the differences are just as important as the similarities. And those are the two designs, basically, that you will find on all the merch. So you want some merch, check it out and see if you like it. Now, something else that I need to mention, we had Q&A month on Patreon. It was lots of fun. And I asked and got a lot of questions from both my patrons, but also you guys who follow me on Facebook and so on. I tried to answer a bunch of them. I was quite busy last month, so I didn't get to all of them, but I will do so. Now, what you can do is, if you want to check all that stuff out, it's a bunch of videos, and most of them are free on Patreon, so I made them public, and you can see them there. And the easiest way to do that is if you go to my Patreon page, just apply the filter. If you go to posts, you click on posts, and then down below there are a couple of filters. And look for the month of June 2019, and then you will find all the posts of that month, and immediately you'll get to the videos. So that's something that you have to look forward to if you haven't checked that out already. And I will put a link in the show notes as well, so that takes you directly to that filter. To get to the show notes, before I forget, so that's wimsblog.com/34, and that will take you to the show notes right away. So that's it for housekeeping and some updates that I wanted to give. And I'm just going to get right into it. So I got a question on Facebook I actually got two questions from Carlos Cruz. And Carlos asked his first question. He said, "Hi there, Wim. What are your thoughts and opinions on PENTJAK SILAT? Is it effective for self-defense?" And it's an interesting question. I haven't answered that one before. Well, here goes. Quick and dirty answer, yes, I think it's effective, but it depends. Longer answer, give you guys a little bit of background. Where did I get started with my SILAT training? Well, I've been doing that for quite a while now. It's been many years. I think it's about 20 years now, maybe a little bit longer, that I started training in SILAT. And I first learned a little bit of a westernized version of Setia Terate, which was brought to Europe and primarily the Netherlands by PENTJAK. But it was already, what I was learning was not the second, but the third generation teacher from that style here in Europe. And there were already a bunch of variations that took it away from the more traditional way that PENTJAK apparently was teaching back then, for a variety of reasons that I'm not going to go into, but it wasn't traditional Setia Terate, so I'm not going to claim that. But that was what I learned at first. I thought it was very interesting. It was a very aggressive style, very focused on self-defense, liked that a lot. And as time went by, I was exposed to a bunch of other stuff, Mafelindo, which is Danilo Santos blend, a wee little bit of Serac, but I'm not going to claim that at all, that I'll know any of it, just played around with it a little bit. But my main influence was Kuntao Silat by Bob Orlando, who was my teacher. And basically one of the most influential people when it comes to martial arts in general for my own personal training and development. So that's a little bit of the background that I have practicing Silat. Now, speaking in general terms, there are many different styles. There's a wide variety of sorts of techniques in those styles. Now, when you look at Silat, which is, for the people who aren't really into it, it's Southeast Asian martial arts. It's just an umbrella term. You can find styles that are very similar to what you see in Shotokan karate. Looks very similar to that. But there are other styles who focus on ground fighting, and the ground fighting looks nothing like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or the Western Greco-Roman wrestling that we have here. It's just a very, very different approach to the ground for a variety of reasons as well. Now, between these two styles, there's a lot of middle ground and lots in between these two extremes that you can find. There's many styles, so it's hard to say, well, when you talk about PENTJAK Silat, okay, what do you mean? Which style? Because they can be so varied. To give you an example, some styles, they specialize in immediately putting you on the ground or in a position where you can't move anymore or you can't really attack anymore. That is the focus of certain styles. Now, other styles are very, very aggressive and they have more of a high risk, high reward strategy. For instance, a lot of the Kuntao that I learned from Bob Orlando was very aggressive. It was going straight down the middle and attacking and going through somebody, as opposed to what you see in some Silat styles, going around somebody or angling off to get to a position where you can do a lot to the person who's attacking you, as opposed to going through them. Now, before I move on, I forgot to mention that. So Kuntao is, to simplify it, is like a blend between Silat, Indonesian and Southeast Asian styles, and Chinese Kung Fu. That's the easiest way to understand it. So it's a blend between Chinese and, let's say, Malaysian, Southeast Asian styles, whereas Silat is what is claimed to be the local styles of that area. So, but it gets very murky. There's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of blending. The historical records are a little bit sketchy sometimes. It's hard to figure out what happened when, who did what, and so on. There was no internet back then, so there's no YouTube of what happened 300 years ago. So it's really hard sometimes. I don't get all that caught up in that kind of stuff. I have nothing to. I have no bone in that fight that I have to absolutely get from the other dogs. So I don't really care as much. But if you do, that's perfectly fine. It's just not my thing. So that out of the way. So there are many styles also that put an emphasis on weapons. That's also something that's very particular to Silat that I like, is that there's a variety of weapons that they use, some very traditional, some quite modern. But it's not just that. It's also that the presence of weapons is assumed from the get-go. That means that the way that they look at self-defense and fighting is that they just assume that the opponent will have a weapon, whether you see it or not. Whether he has it in his hands from the initial confrontation, the start of the conflict or not, doesn't matter. They assume that he will be armed. And in many cases, that means it's going to be an edged weapon. So that assumption changes everything. It has consequences on the way that you do the art, in the way that you approach conflict and use techniques and so on. So, and I'm not going to jump the gun to your second question, but let's compare that to one of the biggest combat sports we have today, mixed martial arts. Well, in a competitive context in MMA, there are no weapons. The assumption is the opponent will not be armed. Now, I'm sure that Thiago Santos would have liked to have a knife or a club or whatever to basically have an easier fight against John Jones last weekend. But no, that's not allowed. That's not going to happen. So if there are no weapons, you approach the fight differently. And that's just one example. Now in SILAT, and this is not necessarily true for all martial arts, they just assume in most styles that I know of. So again, I'm being careful and not to, because somebody's going to, come up with an exception. Hey, William, there's this exception here. This style doesn't use weapons. You're wrong. Okay, I get it. So let me be careful in the way that I phrase it. The vast majority of styles that I've seen in SILAT, they assume the presence of weapons. And that changes the way that you approach things, how you defend yourself. That means that you have to account for what is he doing with the other hand. What happens when you use certain techniques to control the other person? Does he have a free hand or not? He might not be able to hit me or punch me with that free hand, but is he in a position where he can actually draw a weapon from there and then use it against me? Maybe not reach all the way up to my vital organs, but from that control hold, he might actually cut my wrist and just cut me wide open, or at the very least injure my hand, my wrist, my forearm, and so on, so that I have to let go of that control hold. So that is an example of how you have to, if you assume that the opponent is armed, have to take that into account. It's not only the weapon he has in his hand, it's the fact that he might have access to a weapon if you don't control him in a very specific way. So that is an example of one of the things that I like about SILAT, is that in this kind of mindset is very much present. Some of the things that I like is, what I've seen is that there's a very methodical way of using techniques. And in most styles, it's just one technique flows into the next one. And also each technique sets up the next one. Like a good pool player will do, is just he is going to sink one ball and in one go set up the next one. And that is something that I found that is very much present in SILAT. You see it in many other styles as well, but in a different manner. And that gets into the next point that I like right away, and that is that they attack multiple targets in succession instead of focusing on the head to get the knockout, which is what we are pretty much conditioned to in the West because of our background in boxing and then kickboxing and Muay Thai and now MMA, that is focus on getting the knockout by hitting somebody in the head. And this in SILAT is not necessarily the case. I'm sure there are some styles that focus very much on it, but for the vast majority of the ones that I've seen is that they like to vary the different kind of targets that they go after. And that brings me to the third point that I like. It's that they use multiple attacks and multiple types of attacks to go after these targets. For instance, you will see quick slashing type attacks, but they are combined with hard percussive striking techniques as well. So you don't get one kind of pain, you get different kinds of pain and different kinds of strikes, which maybe you are really good at taking blows to the head, but when somebody cuts you, you fall to pieces, and vice versa. It's just an example. It's that there are people who are very used to a certain type of pain and they are not used to another one. And it becomes a problem once they experience it for the very first time when they are attacked for real, as opposed to in the gym. So that's something that I like as well. And then final point, obviously, well, it's filled with dirty tricks, quote unquote dirty, because this is something that I find is a little bit of a misnomer when it comes to self-defense. But the whole concept of fair play is very much alien to all of the SILAT that I've seen. It's just they start with what we would call cheating in a Western mindset. They start with that from the get-go. If you're not cheating, you don't understand the problem, you don't understand the danger. Why would you have fair play? the concept of fair play and self-defense is very, 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 it's just alien to them. So and I like that a lot because I think it's just more effective that way. So these are some of the things that I like, and one of the reasons why I think that SILAT is effective for self-defense. That said, it depends on the teacher, and it depends if the style is compatible with you. Now, what I mean with that is you need to find a teacher who is self-defense oriented, and he has to teach in a way that is realistic. There are teachers, just like there are in all styles of martial arts, who are very focused on maybe an overly traditional way of teaching that has lost relevance because certain pieces have gone missing, or they have been reinterpreted in an incorrect way and lost some of the effectiveness along the way, and so on. Or they might just have a very abstract idea of violence in a modern context in the world that we live now. So that might mean that the way they teach is no longer very much applicable to what we face nowadays. So that's one aspect of it. And again, this is true for every style, but we're talking about SILAT now, so that's what I'm going to mention it for. And then the other thing is you have to find a style that works for you. So Harimau, so a lot of the ground fighting, it's not for me. I don't move like that. My hips don't move like that. I lack the flexibility to do certain things. Same thing for other styles of SILAT, where they have the low crossed positions. My hips don't move well that way anymore. I don't bend in certain ways like many of the Indonesian people and practitioners seem to do. So that's not for me. And so if that's not for you either, well, if you end up going for a style that is like that, it's going to be very, very difficult. So you have to find a style that is compatible with you, with your body, with the way that you like to move and can move. So that would be my answer to your first question, Carlos. Hope that's a good one. And then I am immediately going to go to your next question. And the second question Carlos asked was, do you think Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is the be-all, end-all for self-defense and mixed martial arts? Short answer, no. It is just the dominant one right now. Now, what does that mean? Well, in the early 90s, Gracies Jiu-Jitsu was starting to become a little bit famous, a little bit popular in the United States. And then the Gracies basically helped create the UFC and use it as a vehicle to promote their art. Nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Now, we're over 25 years later now, and we've seen that MMA and especially the UFC has had a meteoric rise in popularity, but also in just the sheer number of people who are practicing it. So it's the name of the game right now when it comes to combat sports, that is mixed martial arts. And when it comes to grappling and ground fighting, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is basically the dominant view because of the background of how it all started with the Gracies, basically being from the very first UFC event, being the champion. Royce Gracie, he won the first one, and he won it by ground fighting. So everybody's like, okay, we need to learn this. And for a long time, the Gracies dominated the UFC. Now, again, people are going to say that this is a knock on the Gracies, but that's not it. And I think a lot of people misunderstand me when I talk about the Gracies. The point that I want to make is this. Right now, how many Gracies compete in the UFC? Well, pretty much none. I think Kron Gracie is going to fight in the UFC now, but he did a couple of MMA fights. But other than that, it was all BJJ. Now, we'll see. I mean, I think he's going to fight Cub Swanson soon. I thought that was the last that I heard. But I think he has maybe 3 or 4 fights in MMA, and he won all of them, big surprise, by going to the ground. So we'll see. We'll see. But other than him, where are all the big Gracie names? Well, they're no longer there. So my point is that just like it happens with fighting, just like I've seen with kickboxing and Muay Thai, is when a certain style or a certain way of fighting becomes dominant, everybody adapts. And then they figure out how do we deal with that, and then everybody knows how to do that too. And then there's this kind of stalling in the sport where everybody's pretty much doing the same thing. And then it kind of levels out and people find different ways of becoming dominant or having basically an edge on their opponents. And then eventually there's going to be a new paradigm shift, and who knows what that will be. Now, my point is this: right now, the basic paradigm has been Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and in particular Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, for the longest time when it comes to MMA, and for historical reasons, and that's fine. I mean, I'm not knocking it about the effectiveness. I'm just saying this is how history unfolded. It's great. Now, what do we mean when I say, well, it's not necessarily the best? Well, first things first. So, what is a method of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? Well, overall, again, oversimplifying, but it's easier to make my point that way. They take the opponent down, they get a dominant position, and then they advance to a point where you can apply a choke or a joint lock and you get a submission. That is pretty much the pathway that every BJJ practitioner uses, pretty much. I know there are exceptions, but generally speaking, that is how the art is practiced. Nothing wrong with that. It works fine. Now I'm going to contrast that with catch wrestling, or catch as catch can. So that's a very different submission wrestling or ground fighting type art. So what they will do is, for instance, they might chain wrestle. They might go for one takedown after the other until they get you. And sure, they might go for a dominant position, but they are very much willing to let it go for a different one. Or they might go for a technique and then let that one go for a different one if they don't really have it. And just continuously attack you in one way or the other. So that's a very different paradigm, a very different method of approaching the ground. And again, nothing wrong with that. That's just a personal method. It's a system that can work just as well as BJJ, and that is perfectly fine. Just have to figure out what is best for you. Now, to give you an example to see that contrast better, and I put this in the show notes. So once again, go to wimsblog.com/34, number 34, and you will see that link. And that is when Dean Lister and Josh Barnett competed in Metamoris many years ago. Now, Dean Lister was one of the finest examples of BJJ practitioners. I think at the time he hadn't been submitted at the highest level in over 10 years. So that's quite impressive. And he was fighting Josh Barnett. That was grappling, not MMA, but it illustrates my point well. And in the video, that you'll see a breakdown of how that went. And they went for a really long time. And you could see the difference in approach between what Josh did and what Dean did. Just watch the video. It takes about 10 minutes. And it's very, very clear then that they have a totally different approach to the ground. Both men are really good at ground fighting. You can't say that one is better than the other. They're both really good. If you fall on the ground and Dean Lister gets his hands on you, or Josh Barnett does, you're in a world of trouble. It doesn't matter if the one is more BJJ oriented or the other one is more catch wrestling oriented. Once he gets you down, you're in a world of hurt. So my point is that there are other systems for the ground than BJJ, and catch wrestling is one of them. You've got shoot fighting, Shudo, you've got Sambo, you've got other ones. They're all very effective. It just depends on the practitioners in how they train and how they approach the sport. I mean, Fedor Emelianenko, he has a very strong Sambo background. We can't say that he's bad at ground fighting. I mean, he's quite effective at it. So but he's just got a very different approach, and so on. So I'll give you my personal preference. I am more inclined to go towards catch wrestling because it suits my temperament better. I also teach MMA, and in my class, I teach my students blend the hybrid between BJJ, catch wrestling, and many other things. And my personal philosophy for ground fighting when it comes to MMA is position, pressure, pain. Now, what does that mean? So we go to the ground, doesn't matter who takes you there. You try to get to either a dominant position or a strong position, which is not the same thing, which I'll talk about another time. Then you apply pressure. You try to crush the guy as much as possible because the pressure is going to make his life difficult. It's going to slow him down. It's going to cost him a lot of energy to resist. It's going to tire him out. And at the same time, you try to cause a lot of pain. And people are used to a lot of pain. But this is one of the things that I liked about catch wrestling is they have a lot of nasty tricks that they use to, for instance, try to separate the shoulder muscle from the bone, try to grind your shins or your elbows or your forearms into really sensitive areas so that if you're feeling that and you're in a horrible amount of pain, you want to get out of it. And that kind of reaction that you get then is going to open up attacks for joint locks, chokes, and so on. So that is my personal preference. Again, I don't think it's better or worse than anything else. That's just that suits my temperament and suits the kind of techniques that I like to do when it comes to MMA. Now, more generally speaking, when it comes to MMA, you need to be well-rounded. So you need to know that there are different styles of ground fighting out there. And regardless of where they come from, you need to know how to handle them. For instance, the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu that you see is not the same as the 10th Planet Jiu-Jitsu that you see from Eddie Bravo. They have a very different approach to ground fighting, even though technically speaking, it's all BJJ. And then when you watch that, and then you watch some catch wrestling or some shoot fighting, it's very different still. They're all effective. It's just that they're different. Well, try them out, see which ones you like best. So that is the first part of my response. And then the second one is you asked for self-defense. Now we're talking about something completely different as far as I'm concerned. And first thing I have to mention is the myth of 90% of all the fights go to the ground. So this, as far as I can tell, I wrote an article about that many years ago. Again, I'll link to that in the show notes. It was Gracie back in the days when UFC started who kind of propagated that myth of 90% of the fights going to the ground when he talked about real fighting, self-defense, context, and so on. That's just not true. Now, I'll link to another article that goes a little bit more into detail about the numbers, but in short, he was basing his statement on a study that was done for the LAPD, Los Angeles Police Force, by Sergeant Dossey, if I'm not mistaken, who basically compiled a bunch of statistics about, okay, so what happens when they arrest somebody and when it comes to violence and so on. And one of the things that it did say was that a lot of situations went to the ground for a variety of reasons. Not all of them had to do that the perpetrator that was being arrested took the police officer to the ground. There are many other situations where that didn't happen. But in many cases, it ended there because the police officer wanted to cuff that person. And cuffing techniques in the vast majority of situations when there's violence involved, when there's a struggle, they cuff the perpetrator on the ground because it's easier to control him and put the handcuffs on him. Sometimes they do it up against a wall, up against a car, but if it happens that there's a struggle, in many cases, police officers will put you on the ground so they can cuff you. That's just standard procedure in the vast majority of the police departments out there, all over the world. So it's very easy then to jump to the conclusion that, well, most fights go to the ground. Well, duh, because the police officer takes it there at the end of the fight when he can control you, when he puts the cuffs on. So you see that's a myth. It's not true. It's not based on fact. It's not based on statistics as the claim goes. I don't know why Horian said that. I can just say what I read and what I heard him say in videos and so on, and so on articles, and then I can cite you the study, and you can look up the study. There's the link is there in when you go to the show notes. You can look up the study yourself and read all about what was actually in that study and what Horian claimed. So that's the first part. Now, second part, when it comes to self-defense situations, the ground is extremely dangerous. For one, you have to assume that there are multiple opponents. So I'll tell you the story of a friend of mine. He got into a fight and he got the guy to the ground. He went into full mount and he started ground and pounding the guy into a bloody mess. And he was doing A-OK. And the next thing he knows, he wakes up in the ambulance. Because what happened? That guy that he was beating up, well, his buddy came running up from behind and soccer kicked him from behind in the head and busted out a bunch of his teeth. And my friend now has dentures. He's had them from a very long time. And he was out. That's it. And he's lucky that apparently, I guess, people pulled that guy off of him. He's lucky to be alive. Because once you're out and somebody starts stomping on your head, you can't defend yourself anymore. So again, going back to what I just said about SILAT, the assumption is that there are weapons involved. Whenever you are in a self-defense context, assume that there are multiple opponents. And if there aren't, then it's a lucky day. It's a really great day. If there are, you're going to act differently than if there's only one opponent, which is the assumption when we talk about MMA, Muay Thai, and all the other combat sports. Well, not all of them, the vast majority of them, for all the anally retentive people out there. So that's one thing. Second thing, there's no referee. There's nobody going to stop you from doing something stupid and killing somebody, but there's also not somebody stopping the guy from choking you out and then keeping the choke on too long and then you eventually die. No referee, doesn't happen. So why would you put yourself in a position where you are potentially at the mercy of somebody? Another point, if you get slammed on concrete, it's not the same as on a mat. You get slammed on the sidewalk. And for those of you who practice BJJ competitions or watch them, slams are forbidden. Why? Because they work real well. Well, guess what? If you get slammed on a mat, it is not the same as getting slammed outside in the street on the ground, on the concrete, and so on. It's not the same. It's much worse. So, final point, weapons. Assume that weapons are involved. Now, I'll put a link in the show notes to an article that I wrote many years ago, and that's something that happened in Belgium. I was in the subway, a purse snatcher robs a woman and runs off, and a guy tries to stop him. And the video is cut at the most interesting point. I don't know why, but the guy catches a purse snatcher. They get into this grappling match. They go half to the ground. It looks like he has him in sort of guillotine headlock type situation. And he's just grappling with him. And in the meantime, that purse snatcher is just stabbing the guy pretty much in the kidneys. Guy lets go, and the purse snatcher runs away. And we see the guy sitting down, and a little bit later, you've got the ambulance coming on, and he's on the floor, and so on. That's one of the example. I can show you many, many, many other examples where somebody went to the ground, and it ended up with losing their life, getting stabbed multiple times, and so on. So here's the point: when it comes to knife fighting, and by that I mean knife self-defense, there are no guarantees. Anybody who tries to sell you guarantees when it comes to self-defense against a knife, he's lying through his teeth. There's no ultimate system. I don't believe it exists. But for sure, what we know is that you lying on the ground and somebody with a knife on top of you or holding on to you, it's a really bad place to be. That's a horrible place to be because there's no way to run. You can't run because you need to get up first. He's not letting you. To give you an example, how many times do you see somebody get taken down by a BJJ guy, whatever? How many times do you see the guy just spring back up in the very first second he hits the ground? It usually takes a little bit longer. It takes a little bit of time. Well, if the guy is armed with a blade, he has time to cut you and stab you in the meantime. And the issue with edged weapons is that one cut, one stab can be enough to end your life. Not necessarily so. Some people take an inordinate amount of damage against a bladed weapon, but others do not. Others just take one stab, one cut, and they die. They bleed out. So that is why I do not advise to basically use BJJ or any ground fighting system as your go-to self-defense system. If your go-to move in self-defense is going to the floor, I think you're playing Russian roulette. Because sooner or later, you're going to get a bullet in that gun and you're going to shoot yourself in the head. Again, that doesn't mean that it can't be effective. And I'm sure you will find many videos as well where you see that guy used BJJ, right? And I will counter that with a bunch of videos where I can show you multiple opponents, where I can show you weapons, where you can see somebody getting slammed and getting knocked out from the get-go, and so on. There's even one where a guy gets beat up on the ground. They do very poor imitation of BJJ on the ground and then ground and pound. And the guy who's getting beat up, his mom comes over to the guy who's in the mount on top of him, beating him up, and she kicks him in the face and knocks him out. His mom. So I can counter every single video that you show of somebody being successful with ground fighting, showing somebody who fails, which is true for many arts. But my point is that if you have dogmatic views of, well, this is the best art for self-defense, then you will be proven wrong eventually. Doesn't mean that it can't work for you. Doesn't mean that there are situations where it will actually be really applicable for self-defense. But if you say best system, which is what the question was, then I disagree. Now that said, more and more people grow up with MMA as their default for fighting. So their default for ground fighting is BJJ, or at the very least the BJJ they see in the UFC and similar organizations. So that means that for self-defense, I believe you need to incorporate this into your training. So learn to avoid the kind of takedowns they like to do, and you practice defensive ground fighting. And by that, I mean primarily trying to get up as quickly as possible. Don't go for offense on the ground, but try to get up as quickly as you can so you can avoid all the different issues that I just mentioned where it can go wrong. That's it. That is the answer to both these questions. So just want to check if that is okay with you, Carlos, if these are good answers to your questions. If not, leave me a comment and we'll see what I can do about that. I want to thank everybody else for listening. Again, go to wimsblog.com/34 for the show notes. And if you want to help out, just, like, share, subscribe. You can do this on iTunes. Leave me a review there. That would be awesome because that helps a lot, actually, in spreading the word of the podcast. And just generally share this podcast with people who might enjoy it. And then I will talk to you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to the Demeere podcast. For more information, go to www.wimsblog.com.